Thank you so much for everybody for coming out to today's webinar. We are so thrilled to be presenting our first BECC webinar of the season. And this is going to be a good one. We're talking about leveraging behavioral science for continuous improvement with strategic energy management. So without further ado, let's get started. For those of you who haven't been to these webinar series before, my name is Reuven Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which is a huge mouthful, so you can just say ACEEE for short. I also co-chair the BECC conference, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change, which is the entity that's bringing you today's webinar. And we like to bring a series of free webinars throughout the year leading up to the conference. It's really a part of the whole conference experience. So thank you for joining us today. This year's conference happens in November, and this year's theme is engaging all voices. As usual, we bring you the latest in cutting-edge research, practice, programs, and evaluation having to do with behavioral science as it applies to reducing energy consumption, mitigating climate change, and adapting to climate change. But this year, we're also focusing especially on bringing out voices you might not always hear from. We want to engage all communities. We want to engage all races. We want to engage people from across the political spectrum, from across the different communities of practice. And so it's really important this year that we highlight all these various groups. And so we're excited about this year's conference. And we've even taken steps to hire our first diversity, equity, and inclusion advisor for this year's organizing committee. So you'll hear more about that later. Now, this year's conference is going to be, I should also mention, registration is now open. And for the first time ever, we're offering a significantly reduced price for nonprofits and universities. But that price is only available during early bird registration. So whether you're at a nonprofit or not, whether you're a university or not, register now to get that early bird price. Now, this year's conference is a little bit different than the past. For those of you who've attended regularly, you'll know that for the past 2 years, we've been completely virtual. And we actually surprisingly, maybe not, found that there were some advantages to being completely virtual, and we like them. For example, it increases inclusion and flexibility for some people who might not be able to travel or might not want to travel for reasons of, sorry, I'm just going to share my screen here. For people who might want to travel for carbon reasons or for other reasons. So one moment while I just sort this out. So I just wanted to point out that this year we're having two component conference. The virtual opening day happens on November 9th. That's completely virtual. And it's part of the conference. And that part of the conference kicks things off. And then we have an in-person component, which is November 13th to 16th at the Capitol Hilton in Washington, D.C. And if you register for the full conference, you have access to everything. But if you want, you can register just for the virtual opening day at a reduced price. And some people will be presenting just at that day. And so to get the full experience, you come to everything. But if you prefer, you can come just to the virtual opening day. Feel free to send us an email about that if you have any questions. Now, I also quickly want to thank our sponsors for 2022. If you're interested in joining this group and getting your eyeballs on this, many eyeballs on your logo going forward, please email info@becconference.org. These sponsors are critical to putting on the conference and these webinars. All right, so Zoom tips. Please remain muted during this webinar, but you can turn on your webcam. That's the beauty of the format we're using here. Zoom meeting. We want to make this a community, not just talk at you. So feel free to turn on your webcam and feel free to chat with everyone throughout the webinar. Either directly chat with folks or put something in the public chat. Tell us what you're thinking. We'll keep an eye on that chat throughout the webinar. And at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the things that we heard in the chat and any questions that come up. It's a discussion format webinar, so there'll be a moderated discussion at the end. We will be looking at what you have to say and what your questions were. So without further ado, I want to now turn it over to our rather extensive panel of speakers. To introduce the speakers, I have Arlene Lanciani, Arlene leads the evaluation, research, and behavior work at the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, or CEE. She also co-chairs the CEE Evaluation Committee. And she manages several research projects at CEE, including the annual State of Energy Efficiency Program Industry, which is a report, and the national surveys of household awareness of the Energy Star label. So thank you very much, Arlene, for putting together today's webinar. I'm going to turn it over to you now to take over.
Thank you, Ruben. Can you see my screen yet?
Looking good.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you. Today's topic comes at the intersection of three committee work areas at CEE and draws on the expertise of the Behavior Committee, the Strategic Energy Management Committee, and the Evaluation Committee. We're really fortunate to have several CEE staff here today, as well as some very knowledgeable and experienced panelists who know a lot about SEM programs, their implementation and evaluation, and I really hope that you will enjoy today's discussion. To provide a sort of view of where we're going to head today, I'm briefly going to cover who is CEE, what is SEM. We'll go over some behavioral insights used in energy efficiency programming in general, and then our panelists will each give an example of where they've seen behavioral insights used in SEM, and then we'll have some moderated discussion and Q&A. Let me just briefly give you an overview. CEE is the US and Canadian Consortium of Gas and Electric Program Administrators. We work together to accelerate the development and availability of energy efficiency products and services for lasting public benefit. Initiatives are adopted using a considered and collaborative and consensus building committee model, and CEE focuses on transcendent needs of the industry. So concentration areas among customers and what the utility members feel are important. CEE members direct about 80% of the $9 billion invested in energy efficiency and demand response annually across the US and Canada. And so we leverage this earned standing across our membership, and we are governed largely by utility members. Just for context setting, I know that there's a range of different expertise here today, but what do we mean when we say SEM? The goal of strategic energy management is really to achieve deep savings at the whole facility level and create an internal customer culture and change to increase commitment to energy management over time. And so this concept of strategic energy management has really existed for decades, but has been more recently adapted into energy efficiency programs. In order to demonstrate the validity of SEM as an energy efficiency program, members of the consortium, together with other industry partners, reached consensus on a minimum set of activities customers should engage in to be considered practicing strategic energy management. And therefore, that warrants the utility investment in support of those activities and programs. So that definition states that SEM is taking a holistic approach to managing energy at the customer site to improve the energy performance and achieve persistent energy and cost savings on the long term. It focuses on business practice change at all levels across the staff at the customer site. So it's an organizational cultural shift to reduce energy waste and improve energy intensity. It's a cultural change that allows management and staff to impact energy consumption through behavioral and operational change. And I think that's a real difference in this type of programming. And though it does not emphasize technical or project-centric measures, SEM principles and objectives may support capital project implementation. So at CEE, we've defined some minimum elements. So to achieve that cultural change, program administrators that support customers practicing strategic energy management specifically support a minimum level of activity. And that includes customer commitment. So at a minimum, customers should demonstrate commitment by creating policies and goals and assigning resources to support strategic energy management activities. They should also take steps to plan and implement energy saving projects and operational changes. So they should perform an energy management assessment. They should map out the energy use. They should establish metrics and goals in a project register. Employees are actively engaged in the process, and then those projects should be implemented, and there should be a periodic reassessment to make sure that it's undergoing the way that things were planned to go. Also, to support all of this, customers should engage in measuring their performance, collecting data for ongoing performance tracking, and perform regular analyses and report the results. So a key to this is strong customer participation, and that's critical to the success across these minimum elements. And that's why we're here today talking about ways to leverage behavioral science to support the successful execution and outcome of these different activities. So now I'd like to present a colleague of mine, Kira Ashby. She's the Principal Program Manager for Behavior at CEE. She directs our newly formed Center for Equity and Energy Behavior. She'll describe some behavioral science insights that have informed energy efficiency program work and how they could potentially be used in strategic energy management.
Great, thanks, Arlene. So as Arlene mentioned, I'm going to give a quick 5-minute sampler of a few behavioral science insights for today. What are these insights, how we can use them, and implications for SEM programs in particular. And when I say behavioral insights, I essentially mean just trying to leverage people's natural decision-making tendencies and the shortcuts that we take in making decisions. My flashing neon sign caveat is that I am not an SEM subject matter expert. So my training is as a behavioral scientist. My background is actually in public health and how to use behavioral science there. So I'll defer to our panelists for any direct connections to the SEM side, but I'm just hoping to set some context on the behavioral front. Next slide, please. So social norms is a really commonly known behavioral insight. It's essentially the unwritten rules of society. So this is why even before the pandemic, if you'd gotten on a bus that was mostly empty, you probably would have not sat next to someone who was a total stranger. We have a tendency to align our behavior with what others are doing. As far as how to use social norms in programs, if you can get people observing others taking action, that really increases the likelihood that they will act as well. So for this reason, it can be easier to encourage behaviors that are more visible, such as recycling. So you see recycling bins lined up outside homes. It's pretty obvious what your peers are doing. Indoor behaviors such as insulation can be trickier to encourage for that very reason. As far as implications for SEM, again, you want to try to make others' actions visible as much as possible. And then you really want to model the target behavior as well. Next slide, please. And speaking of modeling the target behavior, it's also really important who is the one modeling that behavior, which brings us to the next insight, which is the messenger. Who a message comes from can be more important than the content of that message. This is why in commercials, you often see very relatable characters. Maybe it's moms like you, maybe it's someone who's a trusted source like a doctor for pharmaceuticals or medicines. And in general, you want to ensure that the messengers are trusted sources and or are people who are perceived to be similar to the intended audience. As far as implications for SEM, we'll probably hear from the panelists later today that buy-in from the C-suite is key, and that's certainly true. You want to make sure that you have the higher ups on board. But I think just as important, you want to make sure that there's fellow employees who are in similar roles to your intended behavior change folks, and also who are seen as being very consistent in terms of important characteristics and people who feel similar. Next slide, please. Reciprocity is a really fun one. So this is the fact that people feel compelled to return a gift or a favor, even if it's been unsolicited, with something of comparable value or maybe even something of greater value. Charities really have this figured out. This is why they'll sometimes thank you for a donation that you haven't actually given them yet. You may have received appeals from nonprofits that include little gifts like maybe mailing labels with your name on it or some other token. You can also actually see this in free samples at grocery stores. So people assume that maybe a grocery store offers a free sample because if you try the product and you like it, you're more likely to buy the product, which is probably true. But research has shown that having a free sample in a grocery store actually increases the sales of all the products in the store. So there's clearly more going on there than just the trying it and liking it approach. As far as how to use reciprocity, this is a little bit counterintuitive, but you actually want to try to reward behavior change before it happens. So for SEM, this would mean trying to reward employees' efficient choices ahead of time. And you also, with reciprocity, want to be really specific about the action that you're thanking people for taking when you're giving them that gift ahead of time. Next slide. So last but not least, and pretty straightforward, is prompts. And this is just a fancy word for reminders. So reminders are often necessary even when people tend to change their behavior or intend to change their behavior. We're all very busy. We have competing life priorities. We have other things going on. It's easy to forget something you intended to do. You can see just some very simple reminders here as examples. And how you want to use prompts in general is, most basic level, you want to be pointing out the desired behavior, where and when it should happen. And so that translates nicely to SEM. You want to have some kind of reminders in obvious, timely places. You want to try to catch people with prompts at the point when they are making the decision about whether or not they will be taking that intended energy efficient action. Next slide, please. So as promised, this is really just a snapshot of a few of these different behavioral insights and tools. We have gathered 40 plus social science techniques that are in this overview that is available to all on our public website. In addition to explanations of those different techniques, we also have about a dozen or so different case studies of different energy efficiency programs and what it actually looks like in practice when you use some of these different social science techniques. So the examples don't include SEM directly, but I think there's some good parallels there. So I encourage you to check this out after the webinar. Happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, Arlene, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce our panelists.
Kira, thank you so much. We're very fortunate today to have the breadth and depth of experience amongst our panelists. We have everything from SEM program implementation, the program administrator perspective, and program evaluation. And each panelist getting ready for this session and to sort of lead us into the moderated discussion and Q&A part of the webinar was asked the question, how have you seen behavioral science techniques leveraged to enhance engagement in SEM? Or are there opportunities that you see for using behavioral science insight to improve program engagement? And then what's your confidence in the savings resulting from these types of measures and programs? So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Monet Springmeyer. She's a strategic energy management coach and program manager at Cascade Energy.
Great. Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, Arlene. Good morning. As mentioned, my name is Monet Springmeyer. I'm excited to be speaking with you today. So for my example, I took this from my studies, more of an academic approach. So during my MBA, this concept of change management theory and behavioral science in organizations came up a lot. I was really fascinated by the content and then the applications that I saw in my current job as an SEM coach, working with sites on a daily basis. So I wanted to share some of these findings today and then how it applies to SEM. So a major part of behavioral science in business revolves around helping drive change in an organization. In fact, there are lots of theories and models that cover this exact topic. It's important to integrate this into SEM, and that way you can ensure setting up a successful program and maximize the impact on the sites. So as I'm sure you've all experienced as SEM coaches or even in organizations all worldwide, many times you're just thrown into a program with little knowledge or direction. So whatever this circumstance, it's really not the best place to be starting if you want to create lasting change. However, as mentioned, there are some helpful theories that can help with this natural desire that we have as humans to push back on new things and change. And we want to use what we know from behavioral science to combat that. So from the many theories that are available, I wanted to condense that down today. And when it comes down to it, there are really three key elements that are critical when driving change. These three are: 1, communication; 2, building trust; and then 3, follow through. So while these elements all go hand in hand and seem pretty intuitive, each one is vitally important when bringing about change in an organization, and in our case, developing long-lasting strategic energy management programs. So when thinking about SEM, these elements can be applied no matter where a site's at in its program. So first, while communication is important throughout an SEM engagement, it is really the most critical in the beginning of bringing about change. This would correspond to the recruitment and onboarding phase of an SEM program. And as implementers, we're working to help make commitments with the site and building a vision for the program to follow. We're also helping the site to communicate and engage with its employees to create a buy-in. The next element is building trust, which is really critical in getting everyone on board and believing in where the program is headed. This corresponds to the program once the site and team starts to achieve short-term wins and gain momentum, which is usually around the treasure hunt. The third is follow through, which is important in order to let the sites know that this program is meant to last over time. So by sticking with the site and continuing to push forward with the program, you're showing that it's important to you that they persist as well. And this occurs to the site as they move towards the end of maybe their first year and really whenever they're at risk of losing steam. So one thing to note about these models is that they are cyclical. So after the follow through, it's important to go back to the program roots and continue to communicate and build trust with the site so that they're reminded of the vision and where the program is continuing to head. So with that being said, I would really encourage everyone to take a look at their process for driving change, whether it be SEM or anything else, and then try and incorporate these elements wherever possible. And that's what I had. Thank you.
Monet, thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear an example from Kelvin Zone. He's a strategic energy management coach at Energy 350.
Thank you, Arlene. Thanks everybody for having me here. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the treasure hunt as an opportunity that we've seen for using behavioral science insights to improve program engagement and performance. So the treasure hunt, actually, I'm really interested. So the treasure hunt is also known as the Kaizen Blitz. I've heard in the past. Does anybody in the chat want to like give out any other names for treasure hunts they've come across? Feel free to throw those in there if anybody knows of any others. But the treasure hunt that when I came into this, energy scan is another one. Yeah, that's a good one. When I came into this scene like 3.5 years ago, I was not in the energy industry at all. I was a lean consultant, and coming into it, I found that like the treasure hunt was seen more of a, like the energy scan is a good example. We go in as engineers, or not me, I'm not an engineer, but our company would go in as engineers, write down a whole list of ideas that we might be able to find, for them to do, and then present that to them, and then try and push them to do those. Because we know best as engineers which ones are the best ones to do, and that didn't always work so well. Sometimes it did, but didn't always work so well. So we started looking at the treasure hunt as like a different, in a different way. And what we started looking at it as is really an opportunity for employee engagement. And actually, over the years, what we've developed to be our kind of treasure hunt and the way that we deliver it is really an employee engagement event first and foremost. Like the treasure hunt is an employee engagement event. And the output and the benefit, one of the benefits of that employee engagement event is that at least a whole project register full of opportunities that they are actually bought into themselves, because they're the ones that mostly found them, and they work with us to kind of like help value graph them and find out which ones are the best ones for them to do and get their best bang for buck, as it were. So, and one of the things that we did as well with treasure hunts, I mean, it's a long event. If you've ever been to one, they tend to be 6 to 8 hours at full day, which is a lot for someone to ask to throw, a number of employees at. So usually there's a half a dozen to a dozen employees that attend these treasure hunts. And you're asking, especially right now in this environment, like, could you just take, half a dozen people or a dozen people and not have them work on anything else for a day? That's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask of those individuals as well, because they're all busy. And so one of the things that we're going to do is kind of rewarding up front is like, we try as much as we can. And so far, we've pretty much always been successful, I think, is to ensure that the company who is putting on this treasure hunt for their employees or with their employees is paying for food, like good food, like breakfast with coffee and, bagels and baked goods, and then also a lunch, like a full lunch. And that really helps kind of fuel the day, and no pun intended. And also we bring swag along to like give out to people, like, whichever utility you're working with, we'll ask them if they have swag available. We have some as well with Energy 350 that we'll give out. We do like little games and prizes. Like we do a silly one where it's just like, guess how many opportunities we're going to find today. And then, whoever wins that wins like a nice like water bottle or something like that, insulated water bottle. So I really like that idea of rewarding people, and that's something that we found to be very effective as well. But the biggest thing about the treasure hunt that I always enjoy is that usually when people turn up in the morning, you can kind of see them shuffling around, getting a coffee. They're tired, bleary-eyed, and just like sitting down and kind of like, why am I here? What are we doing? I'm wasting a whole day. And usually by the end of that day, you've got that same group who are really excited because they found these like half a dozen opportunities after going, you know, around a plant and walking around and finding these things and going, sitting down and going through each of them and trying to like value graph them as to where they're going to be for energy savings and how hard they're going to be to do. And they end up with like a half a dozen or a dozen or so opportunities that they're really excited about and they are bought into because they're the ones that like mostly found them and decided they want to do these. And usually these half a dozen or dozen opportunities are enough to get them to their goal for the year, which in the beginning of the day when I present them, well, your goal for this year is to save 3 or 5%, you know, energy for the year. They're usually like very like, oh, well, that's a lot, you know, we're never going to do that. And by the end of it, they can see like, oh, this is actually possible. Not only do we have half a dozen to a dozen opportunities to get there, we've got another 50 or 60 that will get us over there. So, again, like the treasure hunt is something that we've taken really at Energy 350, and I know other companies are doing the same thing, and really putting an awful lot of effort into that. And we sell it to them really as like, this is the big event of the year. You're going to do this every year, most likely. And this is where it happens. This is where you find those opportunities. This is where you get that engagement. And also we encourage them when they're walking around the facility that day beforehand to reach out to the department head so that they know we're coming, so that when we're in there, we're not just a bunch of people with clipboards watching people work and writing things down, which is kind of scary. They actually know why we're there, and we'll engage with them, with the frontline workers, and talk to them and ensure that, you know, they're aware of why we're there. And that also kind of gets buy-in for the program that way as well. And last but not least, one of the things that we try and do up front now that we've really started doing in the last couple of years is we've always like promoted the idea of a cross-functional team, but that's usually more from the perspective of job function. And now what we started doing is to say, well, we want it to be cross-functional and also we want it to be diverse. So that's something we've been working on as well, because that, you know, it's backed up by research that diverse teams are higher performing and generate more ideas and are more innovative. So anyway, that's it. I'm gonna wrap it up and pass it on to the next person. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Toddmundsen. He's a professional engineer and an industrial engineer, technical lead for energy efficiency at Bonneville Power Administration.
Thank you, Arlene. Yeah, I was a willing but skeptical mechanical engineer about 15 years ago about O&M and behavioral measures when I was selected by BPA to collaborate with the Northern Energy Efficiency Alliance's staff and contractors to co-fund an energy manager for a year at a Western Washington paper mill and to install an energy management system. And short story, it was a success. And later, just very soon after, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council and BPA adopted strategic energy management, called differently back then. And so for over 12 years, the Energy Smart Industrial program has delivered strategic energy management to industrial facilities. And, you know, I know they're, you know, I think of kind of a belt, suspenders, and bungee cord approach and techniques to behavioral included for energy efficiency savings persistence at these sites. You know, a long-term program offering continuous SEM contributes to, you know, project savings persistence. Those early SEM engagements that Kel mentioned, like a treasure hunt, have found, you know, for one reason or another, a capital project involving control upgrades where the controls have been disabled and kind of resulting in lost savings. And at those engagements or soon after, working with the operators, you know, we've seen those controls reactivated O&M measures, and where they've even improved the capital project's performance. You know, the SEM delivery encourages the use of simple yet effective reminders placed on site, like success posters, you know, succinct reminder documents, standard operating procedures on or near the equipment following the creation of procedures and operator training of these new O&M measures to avoid, you know, reverting to previously less efficient practices. I think documentation, it was mentioned earlier too, with that treasure hunt where they identify and prioritize O&M measures, you know, they're added to a list within an energy management information system with assignments given to team members. The SEM team members take action throughout the year, which along with the measured and verified energy savings achieved eventually are documented in an annual completion report. And communications too, those reminders and documentation with the facility changes of ownership and our site personnel change occurrences, which we see frequently. The project knowledge doesn't get lost entirely, and the savings persist throughout and beyond the SEM engagement with these program communication efforts. We've heard as an evaluation is underway, the success of that with new staff understanding and knowing what those O&M measures were, although they were implemented a few years back prior to their employment there. And lastly, I just want to mention the motivation of our SEM teams we see today on site. They're highly capable with technology. They're skilled with interpreting data and motivated to have an impact towards their organization's sustainability goals. That energy data integration into an energy management information system gives teams the ability to track the effects of implemented or measures and to take timely action as needed. When automation of data integration happens, the tracking of energy performance can be near real time. Thank you.
Todd, thank you so much. Last, I'd like to present Faith DeBolt. She's a principal at SBW Consulting. She's an experienced evaluator and serves on the leadership team of the Northwest Strategic Energy Management Collaborative.
Thanks, Arlene. Thanks, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I do feel a little bit like a fish out of water, being an engineer and impact evaluator over here on the behavioral side. But I think I'm learning that SEM is relies so heavily on behavior change, and I think we've been observing an evaluation that SEM practitioners are highly capable when it comes to leveraging the data that they have access to. And I know that we are running a little long on time first as kind of our opening remarks, so I'm going to keep my remarks a little short and just say, I think there's a growing body of analytical tools and guidance documents to really help leverage all of this data that's becoming available. And like I said, the increasingly capable SEM practitioners. And the other thing I just want to continue to be a cheerleader for is the building performance standards that are getting adopted around the country are really looking to apply these energy management concepts that are being implemented by these programs. So I see them really becoming kind of an integral part of how buildings and industrial facilities are operated. And I think with that, I'll stop because I'm excited to get into the discussion and Q&A with the attendees.
Faith, thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen and we will transition into discussion now. I think that we've all brought up some great topics here, and I would encourage the audience, everyone that's participating in the call today, to ask your questions and add them to the chat. I'd like to start out with a question of my own, and which is, as you engage with different customers, how do you find a champion to engage in the cultural shift? And that might be engaging with someone in the C-suite or at that level of the organization. And are there any behavioral science techniques or tactics that you use? Question to our panelist.
Yeah, I'll take that. Kind of as I mentioned, a lot of times the energy champion will kind of be presented to you when you're recruiting. Either it's the process engineer who has extra time or not. So what's really key there is zeroing in, finding who the decision makers are, and and also getting them to participate as well so that you can kind of develop that trust with them, start to get their buy-in. As I was mentioning earlier, communication is huge. So why you're here, why you should be involved, that sort of thing. And I felt that that's a great way to develop a strong core SEM team. And then once you have that developed, you can kind of branch out to the operators or the C-suite. Once you have one person that really trusts in you and knows, you know, you're well intentioned, it can develop from there for sure.
Todd here. I would add, you know, typically there's been, you know, that assigned energy champion has been involved in the program, done maybe a previous capital project earlier, and so kind of developed that relationship with the program and with the utility. And so as you know, as the SEM opportunities presented to the facility and ownership or management assigns an energy champion, it's usually that one who's most familiar with energy efficiency. So they kind of get drawn in and hopefully enthusiastic throughout and such.
Thank you. I'm going to direct your attention to one of the questions in the chat. Are you delivering these engagement concepts with an on-site presence, or if not, what did you do during COVID? Did you find success with these programs around engagement when entirely remote? Timely question.
That was a question mostly for Todd, but I assume anyone can answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to
Cal,
get started. Or
please.
Todd, if you want to go ahead, that's okay.
Well, yes, there has certainly been a shift to remote, even some remote energy scans early on, but kind of as safety practices and you know, booster shots and all that took place, there certainly has been more return to on-site activity. And going forward, it, you know, probably be a mix of remote, because there has been some learnings with remote delivery of SEM. Matter of fact, we have a SEM cohort that's spread across the Pacific Northwest from Montana to Western Washington, and we probably aren't going to have on-site cohort workshops due to travel constraints, but we will have you know, our program, which has staff from almost all four corners of our territory, you know, be on site to do energy scans, treasure hunts, and some other activities.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as well, that one of the things that we found is the cohort participants really appreciate not having to travel for workshops for several reasons. One is that it just saves them a lot of time travel. Also, it means that on-site staff who have to be on call can be at workshops, which often are the kind of people we want to be at workshops, like maintenance staff, people like that. So it's been a real kind of blessing in that way, that like we're now able to offer programs to a much more kind of diverse group of organizations scattered over a much wider geographic area. The one thing I will say is we've tried with success and sometimes without success to do a treasure hunt remotely. It's a mixed bag. We've had a few that went really well, and we've had one or two that went really badly because of it being remote. And usually it's when it's a very large group of, like, we had one that was a group of 20 people at their facility who were all trying to social distance, and I was on a tiny little screen on a laptop, like way away, and they couldn't hear me properly. It was a nightmare. And it was really a technology challenge, and it just didn't work very well. So in-person treasure hunts, we definitely try and stick to if possible. So, but most of the rest can be done remote.
Thank you. I really like this question in the chat. How do you keep momentum going year after year when energy savings become more difficult, expensive to achieve? So are there diminishing returns? I might just add.
There are a few sites that, you know, have been in the program for 10 years, and they have continued to maintain savings and to find maybe capital measures that weren't identified early on, or there's a change in process that identifies this capital opportunity. So we've had some that have had a gentle off ramp after a few years, and normally it's more because of staffing constraints or being shifting elsewhere. Just because savings are maintained, that engagement with the utility has felt very valuable to continue. But diminishing returns, surprisingly, in 10 years hasn't been a factor to kind of call an end to the engagement.
One thing I've found some success with is, trying to get more involvement from different parts of the facility, maybe getting some fresh blood in the team and seeing if that can maybe revamp, some opportunities. It can be that there's a point where they go, well, it's too expensive to implement these projects. We're kind of done. Then maybe focusing on persistence. And also, we're building these cyclical programs. So the hope is once you leave, they'll still be, doing all these energy team meetings and they'll still do their own treasure hunts. So, there could be a day where, you kind of back off from the site and hope that they would take those learnings away and continue that.
I'd add to that as well that ultimately the goal of the program is we always call it baking SEM into the culture of the organization, just like their safety program. Everybody's in some ways aware of it or thinking about how they're using energy or how their coworkers are using energy. And once they get to that point, there might not be a ton of opportunities to be found at new treasure hunts, and there might be some diminishing returns in having these full day treasure hunts every year. But that doesn't mean that the program itself goes away, because it's already part of their culture. And then we like to call it graduate them into doing this themselves. So it never really ends. That's the goal of SEM, really, is that it's an ongoing thing that you always do. But there are some diminishing returns, I would say, on the initial couple of years where you're really finding a ton of opportunities to just maintaining the persistence on the opportunities that you've implemented. But there's always more things happening, because life comes along and changes things, and COVID happens and other things happen, and then you have to go back to square one sometimes. So.
And I'll just add, that behavior change can be kind of legislated to persist and continue to motivate to, maintain and further reduce energy use and carbon emissions. And that's what building performance standards are about, at least on the kind of more commercial and multifamily buildings side of things. If you have lower and lower targets you have to hit, you're going to be motivated.
Yeah, you might, Faith, you might be able to speak to this question. What is sort of the persistence of these types of measures associated with O&M changes or even behavioral changes? And can you claim savings for these measures over time? And what are typical allowable measure lifetimes?
Yeah, we've seen persistent studies find, I think Energy Trust recently had a study find 7 years was a measured life for SEM. And, I think 3 years to 5 years is pretty typical for the measured life for savings being claimed for SEM.
Yeah, we're one of the rare programs out there that still applies a 1-year measure life to SEM, perhaps, and we're currently undergoing an evaluation where we could see that change, as Faith mentioned. We'll see where it lands, though.
We have a lot of good questions coming up in the chat. I'd like to bring your attention to one that I just read. Oh, here it is. SEM programs typically are targeted at the largest energy users, which tend to be large companies. Thinking with a diversity and equity and inclusion lens in mind, how can SEM be used to reach more diverse businesses?
I'll just mention here that, that cohort that I mentioned is going to launch soon. It is a blend of, yes, a large industrial site or two, several mediums, but what some might call fairly small. It's just kind of the combination of those as far as, total energy use and savings potential based on some percentage of estimated savings. So we don't exclude smaller sites, but we haven't done just a small site only cohort yet. So we try to combine large, medium, small, and include, especially with the remote delivery, we can include those far corner sites that weren't cost effective to include in a cohort before.
And here's a question in the chat. How do behavioral change strategies differ between industrial and commercial sectors? Or is there any difference in approach that you might take?
I'll be the first to say I work only with industrial sectors, so I am not proficient in commercial, but I would imagine the behavioral change and, organizations getting together and doing their part is consistent throughout. So whether it's someone turning off the light before they leave for the evening, or whether it's someone turning off a machine before they leave for the evening, they might have different magnitudes, but it's still kind of that we're all in this, we're doing this program. But that's about the extent that I could speak to that.
Yeah, I would add to that. I've done a little bit of commercial now. Mostly I've done industrial, but with the commercial sites that I work with, it's actually a school system. And so they had a whole bunch of schools in one area that they managed. The thing that was very different was that it's not just one facility. It was like multiple facilities spread across quite a wide geographic area. And each one of those facilities had their own people that you had to connect with. So, and then there wasn't just the people that work at the facility, then there was the teachers and there was the students and the student bodies. So like there was way more going on. So the thing that I learned in working with them is you can't do it all at once. So like the first year was really just about like getting people who are at the facility level and managing the facilities involved and looking at like the HVAC systems and things like that and working with them. And then the next turn was like, well, let's look at the teachers, and they had a green team that the teachers were part of. So we engaged with them. And then later it was like, well, maybe we can look at students as well, but we haven't gotten there yet. So I think there's just more levels of like different kinds of cultural groups within that facility. Just like if you have a commercial building, where there's the people looking after the building, and then there's the people who are like renting from there, and they're all different organizations maybe, or a residential building, things like that. So just there's more different groups involved. So I think it just gets a little bit more complex in that way, but it's less complex when it comes to, I guess, the machinery and the engineering side of things in some ways. Less different kinds of complexity.
Kel, I don't know if that was in response to one of the questions that specifically asked if any of you were working with schools and making any efforts to get students involved in addition to the employees and teachers. But
it was not, no.
That was one of the questions though.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we haven't gotten the students involved yet.
Yeah. So here's another, what I think is a very good question. Can you provide examples of how you encourage energy efficient social norms if it isn't currently part of the organization's culture?
Do SEM? I guess I would ask for a clarification on the question.
Let's see, the question was from Shannon Hardman. I don't know if you want to clarify your question.
Arlene, I can take that one because I tried to answer Shannon's question through the chat and basically just said that having leadership, someone in leadership modeling the behavior or telling a story about examples where employees who maybe weren't the norm initially, but are starting to become more common, have taken that intended behavior. So thinking about you kind of leveraging the messenger and people who are respected or you to be similar, and sort of starting from there.
I guess there is one I could think of, and that's, I was just reading the question again. A lot of especially industrial facilities, they tend to have, like, at the beginning of each shift, a team check-in or a shift change or whatever they want to call it. And it has a specific agenda, things they go over, and we try and encourage them to add to that agenda, like, oh, any energy savings ideas that we've come up with, anything we want to bring up. And also at those meetings, if there's a specific update, like we just got an update to the monthly energy model and know how much they're saving, to provide that update at those meetings. So to normalize the idea of just talking about energy and how much they're using and how much they are saving and what kind of projects are going on.
Thank you, Cal. So here's another question I think that you might be able to answer. Does the typical treasure hunt start off with some examples of the types of things that you will see? Or do you just let people start with a blank slate and have them come up with all the ideas on their own?
No, definitely we have a lot of examples. So we have workshop number 2, which is really focused on that. And we introduce, depending on which utility you're working with, there's the 7 quick wins. We have the 5 simple savers. And those are all kind of like big kind of bucket ideas around the kind of opportunities you might find. Like one of them that everybody has is like turn it off. The other one is fix the leaks. And then we'll have them think about the kind of opportunities they can find like that at the workshop. And then I'll reintroduce all of those during the morning of the treasure hunt. We do an orientation so that anybody that didn't attend that workshop will also get the 5 simple savers. We have posters, we have little cheat sheets that they can take along with them to at the treasure hunt to find those. But yeah, they're just kind of like big picture, kind of like these are the kinds of things that you want to find, because otherwise people will start finding, people don't always have the best idea of like what is considered a capital project and what's an O&M project. So like we really want to focus on the O&M and that helps with that.
I'll also say we have very similar structures to Kill. We found that, by giving them examples, by going through scenarios, it kind of helps break people out of their shells, because no one wants to be the first one to raise their hand and give an idea and be like, that's wrong. So it just kind of helps, even though we would never say that, but it just helps guide the conversation so we can spend more time focusing on, what we have, what we think might be important for the day.
I note that Augie also has suggested these commercial energy talk cards you can see in the chat. And there's a link there that might help.
Here's an interesting question. I'm going to butcher your name, but Marjan Shirazi asked, can you give an example of methods to measure the employee engagement and improvement? And thank you.
Would that be something along the lines of an energy management assessment? There are different versions out there, but I know Inventa had one 20 years ago, but I believe there's some elements of that in an EMA, whether it's one that's an implementer designed one, or again, like the bigger Inventa old one.
Yeah, definitely an EMA. I remember when I was working in industry, a good idea maybe to present to a site would be developing KPIs for, how many people attended energy meetings or how many people submitted ideas. That could definitely be a place to suggest to the site. But I think EMAs are also very helpful when determining that.
Yeah, I'll second all that. And just to add to what Monet said as well, we actually track every single planned meeting we have with our sites and who turned up to those meetings. And we found that sites that have very consistent check-ins with us and meet with us more often and have more people turn up tend to do better. So it's a good way to measure engagement as well.
And my good friend Kevin Wallace reminded me, yes, the NIA online EMA tool. It's right there.
Sort of as a follow-on question to that, are there, what type of indicators do you use? Do you have, I think, Monet, when we were planning the call, you spoke about some key performance indicators for customer engagement.
Yeah. And I think Kel mentioned the tracking who attends meetings. That's crucial, for a gut check on how a site's doing and their engagement. Just KPIs such as, like I mentioned, who's attending meetings for the site, having them keep track of it as well so that they can gauge where their site is at for that.
I'm reading a question from Kevin Wallace and just talking about, is behavioral different than O&M, or are they the same? And maybe as a follow-on to that, what's involved? Is one sort of the outpouring of the other? Is there a procedure for developing O&M measures? Is my own add-on to Kevin's question.
I tend to think of O&M as kind of the more technical focus on like processes and equipment and controls, and behavioral is, the people's kind of keeping an eye on them and working together to meet and discuss the opportunities. We going through an evaluation, we kind of looked at, again, do you try and distinguish them separately? And behavioral might be, yeah, we meet regularly and call that it, and kind of the others are the more the technical O&M focus. But I kind of think there's just an interweaving of them. I don't like to just like fine cut separately, so I kind of keep them together somewhat.
Yeah, I would argue that every single proposed measure has a behavioral aspect to it. If it involves a person doing anything, then their behavior is going to impact the success of it. Some have more, than others, but yeah, I would argue that, because ultimately, like, whoever's doing it, if they're not thinking about like, well, how are other people going to be thinking about this when I leave this company one day, maybe, et cetera, that all gets into it as well. It's a big part of persistence, ultimately.
There's a question from Tom Kabat. Are there complementary workplace culture initiatives that management might want to implement to increase the effectiveness of an employee engagement with SEM?
I guess I would start with that by saying that if an organization has a continuous improvement culture, meaning that they really are focused on the cultural side of their lean manufacturing program or their continuous improvement program, whatever they're calling it, making sure that you're kind of connecting with them about that and showing them how this is really complementary to that, and also not reinventing the wheel. So if they have a change management team, that get those people on the energy team. And we found out organizations that have really strong continuous improvement cultures do really well in SEM, because it complements it really well.
Well, this has been a really fantastic and interesting, engaging conversation. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to cut it off because we're at time. And, this happens every time that we got so many great questions from folks in the chat. Thank you all for submitting. Thank you to all the panelists, and especially Arlene for emceeing. I just want to bring everybody's attention to the fact that BECC has these webinars regularly. This is the first one of 2022, but we're going to be having them more. So stay tuned to the BECC website, becconference.org, and stay tuned to our mailing list, and sign up for the next free webinar coming up, hopefully next month or maybe the month after. And check out the website itself for registration to the BECC conference, which is in November. I'm going to sign off now, and I'll just say see you later.